It is 6:47 a.m. on June 6, 1944. Commander Samuel Dealey stands in the cramped, sweating conning tower of the USS Harter, his eyes pressed against the periscope rubber. Outside that thin steel hull, the moonlit waters off Tawi-Tawi are churning with white foam. He is watching 3 Japanese destroyers cut through the ocean with deadly precision, and they are not just passing by. They are hunting him. The Imperial Japanese Navy has dispatched the Minazuki, the Hayanami, and the Tanikaze with one specific set of orders, which is to eliminate the American submarine that has been terrorizing their supply lines for 3 weeks. In any naval academy in the world, the lesson for this situation is identical. You run. You dive deep. You rig for silent running, and you pray the physics of the ocean hides you. The math of survival in 1944 is brutal and absolute. A Japanese destroyer moves at 35 knots. A submerged American submarine struggles to reach 9. If you try to fight a destroyer on the surface, their 5-inch guns will rip you apart before you can load a torpedo. If you try to run underwater, their sonar will find you, and their depth charges will crush your hull like a tin can. Between December 1941 and March 1944, Japanese destroyers had already sunk 14 American submarines. 0 American submarines had ever sunk a Japanese destroyer while both vessels were actively engaged in combat. It was a suicide mission. But on this morning, Commander Dealey looks at the lead destroyer, the Minazuki, through his periscope. She is closing fast, zigzagging specifically to avoid torpedo attacks. Behind her, 2 more destroyers are spreading out in a search pattern, effectively boxing the Harter into a kill zone. The trap is set. The math says Dealey is already dead. But instead of ordering a crash dive, instead of turning his stern to the enemy and fleeing into the depths, Dealey does something that makes every officer on the bridge stop breathing. He orders flank speed ahead, straight at the destroyer. He swings the Harter's bow directly at the onrushing warship. The range is 1,100 yards and closing rapidly. The time to collision is 96 seconds. This is a tactic that violates every assumption of submarine warfare. It is a maneuver so aggressive and so dangerous that the crew in the conning tower has a grim nickname for it. They call it down the throat. The concept is terrifyingly simple. You fire your torpedoes straight at the attacking destroyer's bow as it charges you, and then you dive directly beneath its keel, hoping you don't get rammed. If your torpedoes miss, the destroyer will drop depth charges directly on top of your position, and you will die. If you dive too late, the destroyer will ram you, and you will die. Dealey watches the Minazuki fill his periscope. He is playing a game of chicken with a 1,250-ton warship. At such close range, a collision is almost guaranteed. But he waits. He needs the enemy to commit. He needs them to think they have him. And in that split second of hesitation, the entire history of naval warfare is about to change. Before we dive into the chaotic aftermath of that decision, I want to welcome you to the channel. We are dedicated to rescuing these forgotten moments from the dusty archives of history, telling the stories of the men who stared death in the face and didn't blink. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It is a small gesture from you, but it helps us keep these memories alive for the next generation. Now, let's go back to the conning tower of the USS Harter, where 96 seconds is all that stands between life and death. To understand why Commander Dealey's order to charge straight at the enemy was considered absolute insanity, you have to look at the scoreboard. Until April 1944, the unspoken rule of the Pacific War was terrifyingly simple. American submarines did not fight Japanese destroyers. They ran from them. The physics of naval combat made this a necessity, not a choice. A destroyer moved at 35 knots, cutting through the water like a knife. A submerged submarine struggled to reach 9 knots. It was a race you could not win. The statistics from the first 2 years of the war painted a picture of slaughter. Between December 1941 and March 1944, Japanese destroyers had hunted down and sunk 14 American submarines. That is 14 crews, nearly 1,000 men, erased from existence in the crushing darkness of the deep. On the other side of the ledger, the number was 0. 0 American submarines had ever managed to sink a Japanese destroyer while both vessels were actively engaged in open combat. The score was 14-0. In the eyes of the Navy Department, engaging a destroyer that was already hunting you wasn't just dangerous, it was considered suicide. The standard doctrine taught at Annapolis and reinforced in every training manual emphasized stealth and evasion above all else. If a destroyer detected you, you didn't stand and fight. You went deep, you rigged for silent running, and you prayed the depth charges missed. You were the prey, and they were the predators. Destroyers were faster, better armed, and designed specifically for one purpose: to kill submarines. But Samuel Dealey, a 37-year-old commander with 5 war patrols under his belt, looked at that equation and saw a flaw. He wasn't reckless, he was calculating. He realized that the greatest strength of the Japanese destroyer captains was also their greatest weakness: predictability. They operated on a strict set of assumptions. They knew submarines were slow, and they knew submarines were terrified. They expected submarines to run. Dealey understood that this expectation created a psychological blind spot. When a submarine did the unthinkable, when it turned and charged straight at the hunter, the Japanese captain on the bridge was forced to process data that didn't make sense. In that high-pressure environment, with torpedoes closing the range at 46 knots, the destroyer captain had to make an instant decision with incomplete information. Should he turn left? Turn right? Maintain course to ram? Fire his deck guns? Dealey banked everything on the belief that this confusion would buy him time. When the harder charged, Japanese captains hesitated. That hesitation cost them exactly 12 seconds. In the brutal calculus of war, 12 seconds doesn't sound like much, but 12 seconds was enough time for torpedoes to close the gap. 12 seconds was the difference between a predator and a victim. By the time the Japanese captains realized their mistake, the torpedoes were already hitting the hull. This was the birth of the down-the-throat tactic. It required nerves of steel and perfect timing. You had to fire torpedoes straight at an attacking destroyer's bow, wait for the impact, and then dive beneath her keel before the flaming wreckage or the ship itself crushed you. If your torpedoes missed, the destroyer would drop depth charges directly on your position. If you dove too late, the destroyer would ram you. It was a maneuver with 0 margin for error. But on that night in June, facing 3 destroyers determined to kill him, Dealey decided it was time to change the math. At 900 yards, Dealey orders the firing sequence. 4 torpedoes streak from the tubes in a spread pattern. 40 seconds later, the physics of the engagement resolve themselves with violent finality. 2 torpedoes slam amidships into the Minazuki. The explosions are so massive, they shake the harder violently enough to shatter light fixtures inside the submarine. A third explosion physically lifts the submarine's stern 6 feet before slamming it back down. By the time Dealey brings the boat back to periscope depth, the Minazuki is already gone, broken in half, and sinking in just 5 minutes. But Dealey wasn't done. While most commanders would have taken this victory and vanished, he stayed in the area. The hunter had tasted blood. Just 24 hours later, under the cover of a pitch-black night with heavy clouds blocking the moon, the Harder surfaced to recharge batteries. It was 2:30 in the morning. This is that strange, quiet hour where the world feels suspended between days. I'm curious, actually. Where are you listening to this from right now? Is it late at night where you are, or are you starting your morning? Drop a comment with your city and local time. It's always fascinating to see how global this crew is. Back in the Philippine Sea, at that exact dark hour, the radar screen lit up. A single ship, the destroyer Hayanami, was closing at 28 knots. Her captain, Commander Hideo Kuboki, was exhausted, just minutes away from returning to base after a long patrol. He never saw it coming because nobody expected an American submarine to be sprinting on the surface at 21 knots to intercept a destroyer. Dealey closed the range to get inside the enemy's radar detection zone, turning the submarine into a surface torpedo boat. At 3,000 yards, Kuboki finally realized his mistake and turned to ram, but the trap was already sprung. Dealey fired at 2,300 yards. The explosion tore the destroyer's stern completely off, sending the ship rolling 90 degrees while her propellers were still spinning in the air. 2 destroyers in 2 days. The Imperial Japanese Navy was furious. Admiral Toyota pulled 8 destroyers from convoy duty and formed hunter-killer groups with one specific order: kill that submarine. Yet, on June 8th, Dealey found them first. He spent 90 minutes stalking the Tanakaze, analyzing its zigzag pattern like a mathematician solving an equation. He realized the ship changed course every 8 minutes, giving him a tight 30-second window to set up a shot. When the moment came, he didn't miss. A torpedo hit the forward magazine, causing an explosion so massive the Harder's crew heard it clearly through the hull, even with the hatches sealed. By June 9th, the ocean was swarming with enemies. Dealey popped his periscope up to see 4 destroyers steaming in a line abreast formation, actively pinging for him. The sonar sound was so loud the operator could hear it without headphones. The logical move was to flee. Instead, Dealey identified the second destroyer in the line, calculated its course, and fired 3 torpedoes at 1,800 yards. All 3 hit. This was the breaking point. The remaining destroyers converged, dropping 23 depth charges in the first 10 minutes alone. Inside the Harder, the lights died. Emergency lighting flickered on. The hull plates groaned and screamed under the pressure as Dealey took her down to 500 feet. A pipe burst in the forward torpedo room, spraying high-pressure seawater across the deck. For 2 hours, they sat in the dark, repairing damage in silence while the ocean around them detonated. When they finally surfaced, the sea was empty. 4 Japanese destroyers had been erased from the map in 4 days. The down-the-throat gamble had paid off, but the Harder had burned through 60% of her fuel and nearly all her luck. Dealey radioed his report, but he had no idea that his rampage had just triggered a butterfly effect that was about to doom the entire Japanese fleet. While Commander Dealey was deep underwater, sweating out the stale air and counting his remaining diesel reserves, a different kind of explosion was detonating 3,000 miles away in the headquarters of the Imperial Japanese Navy. This is where the story shifts from a tactical thriller to a strategic mystery, revealing how a single submarine inadvertently toppled the dominoes of an entire empire. We often look at history as a series of isolated battles, but what happened next is the ultimate example of the butterfly effect in warfare. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the massive mobile fleet at Tawi-Tawi, was looking at the same ocean as Dealey, but seeing a completely different horror story. The reports on his desk were catastrophic. 4 destroyers lost in 4 days. In the mind of a terrified admiral, this couldn't possibly be the work of one rogue boat. Ozawa's logic dictated that the Americans must have massed a wolf pack of submarines right outside his doorstep. He did the math and concluded that his defensive screen was disintegrating. If he stayed at anchor, his battleships and carriers were sitting ducks. Driven by this phantom menace, Ozawa made a decision that would doom the Japanese naval air arm forever. He sent a frantic message to Admiral Toyota. The fleet had to leave Tawi-Tawi immediately. Toyota agreed. On June 10th, at 0800 hours, the Japanese mobile fleet weighed anchor and steamed toward the Philippine Sea. Here is where the fog of war clears to reveal a tragic irony. The Japanese war plan, Operation Ago, wasn't scheduled to begin until June 15th. By forcing the fleet to depart nearly a week early, Dealey had thrown a wrench into a delicate machine. The consequences were mechanical and brutal. Leaving early meant Ozawa's reconnaissance aircraft launched without fully topping off their fuel reserves, drastically limiting their search range. It meant his destroyer screens were scattered and unorganized. It meant his pilots, many of whom were green replacements, missed their final critical days of training and coordination. But while the Japanese were scrambling in chaos, the Americans were watching in high definition. This is the layer of the war that was invisible to the men on the harder. American codebreakers, the silent warriors of the Ultra Intelligence Program, intercepted Ozawa's movement orders within hours. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the U.S. Fifth Fleet, didn't just know that the Japanese were coming. He knew exactly when and how disarrayed they were. The result was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which began on June 19th. History remembers it as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American pilots shot down 376 Japanese aircraft while losing only 30 of their own. It was a slaughter so one-sided, it broke the back of the Imperial Navy. But historical analysis reveals the dirty secret of that victory. The Turkey Shoot happened because the turkeys were tired, blind, and uncoordinated. Ozawa's fleet was disorganized because they had fled Tawi-Tawi in a panic. And they fled Tawi-Tawi because Samuel Dealey had terrified them into believing the anchorage was a death trap. Admiral Charles Lockwood later wrote that Harder's Fifth Patrol was the most strategically important submarine operation of the Pacific War. It forces us to ask an uncomfortable question about the nature of heroism and command. Did Intelligence Command know that by sending Dealey into that hornet's nest, they would provoke exactly this kind of panicked response? Was the Harder the ultimate bait in a game of 4D chess played by admirals who would never smell the diesel fumes of a submarine? We may never know the full intent, but the result is indisputable. Dealey thought he was just hunting destroyers to survive. In reality, he was setting the table for the biggest carrier victory in history. By August 1944, the Pacific Ocean had changed. The element of surprise that Dealey had wielded like a weapon in June was gone. The Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer reacting with panic. They were reacting with cold, calculated adaptation. When the Harder departed Fremantle on August 5th for her 6th war patrol, she wasn't alone. She was the leader of a wolf pack, accompanied by the USS Hado and the USS Hake. On paper, 3 submarines hunting together should have been invincible. In reality, it may have been their undoing. The Wolfpack tactic relied on coordination, and coordination required communication. As the 3 submarines ravaged Japanese shipping off the Philippines, sinking 4 cargo ships in a single morning, the airwaves buzzed with radio traffic. What Dealey didn't know was that Japanese intelligence was listening. They intercepted the transmissions between the American boats during the Palawan Bay attacks and triangulated their position. They knew exactly where the wolfpack was hunting, and this time they didn't send a fleet of heavy destroyers to be slaughtered. They sent something smaller, nastier, and designed specifically for this kind of close-quarters murder, a Kaibokan escort ship, the CD-22. The morning of August 24th broke with a deceptive calm. At 4:53 a.m., the USS Huck submerged 4 miles off Hermana Mayer Island. Through his periscope, the Hake's captain watched the Harder sitting on the surface about 4,500 yards away. It is a haunting image. The legendary destroyer killer basking in the early light, unaware that the clock had finally run out. Then, the Hake's sonar operator heard a sound that made his blood run cold. The rapid, high-pitched ping of echo ranging. The CD-22 was closing fast. At 0530, Dealey spotted the trap. He ordered a crash dive, desperate to get under the thermal layers. But in his haste, or perhaps due to the fatigue of constant combat, a critical mistake occurred. As the Harder descended at a steep 35-degree angle, her diesel engines were still running, or the vents weren't managed perfectly, leaving a massive trail of disturbed water and bubbles on the surface. To the sonar operator on the CD-22, that bubble trail was a neon arrow pointing directly to the submarine's grave. The Japanese captain didn't hesitate. At 0547, just 17 minutes after the dive began, CD-22 passed directly overhead and unleashed hell. This wasn't a random barrage, it was a precise bracketing. 15 depth charges dropped in a perfect pattern. Inside the Harder, the world ended in violent concussion. The explosions cracked the pressure hull near the aft torpedo room, and seawater blasted in with the force of a freight train. We need to talk about the physics of what happened next, because sunk is too gentle a word. As the stern flooded, the submarine tipped vertically, dragging the bow toward the bottom. Dealey tried to blow all ballast to emergency surface, but the weight of the water was too great. The Harder plummeted past her test depth. At 600 feet, the structural integrity of the steel failed. The hull didn't just leak, it imploded. The pressure collapsed the bulkheads and crushed the compartments like tin cans. It happened so fast, less than 3 minutes from the first depth charge to total destruction, that the human brain likely couldn't even process the event. On the surface, the ocean belched up the grim evidence: large quantities of oil, shattered wood from the deck, and cork insulation. The CD-22 circled for 2 hours, dropping more explosives just to be sure, but there was no need. 79 men, including the legendary Samuel Dealey, were gone. For 80 years, that was the end of the story. A patch of oil and silence. But the ocean holds its secrets only as long as we let it. In May 2024, an exploration team led by Tim Taylor and the Lost 52 Project sent autonomous underwater vehicles into the darkness of the South China Sea. At a depth of 3,750 feet, they saw a shape emerge from the gloom. There she was, the USS Harder. She sits upright on the seafloor, almost defiant in her final resting place. The hull is mostly intact, except for the catastrophic damage near the conning tower, where the depth charges broke her back. Seeing her sitting there in the eternal dark, frozen in time, brings a heavy sense of closure. It answers the final mystery. There was no escape attempt, no lingering suffering on the bottom. It was instant, violent, and final. The destroyer killer had fallen to the very weapon she had spent a lifetime evading, leaving behind a legacy that changed naval warfare forever, and a steel tomb that now rests peacefully, miles beneath the waves she once ruled. The discovery of the USS Harder in May 2024 wasn't just an archaeological find, it was a resurrection. For 80 years, the final resting place of Samuel Dealey and his 79 men was a coordinate on a map marked only by conjecture and grief. But when the underwater exploration team, led by Tim Taylor and the Lost 52 project, sent their sensors down into the abyss of the South China Sea, the data that came back was breathtaking. Sitting at a crushing depth of 3,750 feet, the Harder appeared on the monitors. She wasn't a scattered field of debris, as one might expect from such a violent implosion. She was sitting upright. There is something profoundly haunting about that image. Even in death, the Harder refuses to lay on her side. She sits on the ocean floor as if she is still on patrol, her bow pointing into the eternal darkness, waiting for a target that will never come. The pressure hull is mostly intact, preserving the tomb of the men inside, though the damage near the conning tower tells the brutal story of those final, fatal depth charges. It is a protected war grave now, untouched and silent, a sharp contrast to the chaotic violence that sent her there. But while the steel hull rests in the deep, the spirit of what happened in 1944 is still very much alive above the surface. If you walk into a classroom at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis today, you will find that future submarine commanders are still studying Samuel Dealey. They don't teach the down-the-throat tactic because modern warfare has changed. Torpedoes are wire-guided now, and engagement distances are measured in miles, not yards. They teach it because of the psychological principle it represents. Dealey proved that when an enemy expects you to bleed, the most dangerous thing you can do is attack. He taught the Navy that the only way to survive a disadvantageous equation is to change the variables with aggression. This legacy is vital because the living memory of the Harder has finally faded. The last survivor of the crew, a man named Paul Bryce, who wasn't on that final patrol, passed away in 2022 at the age of 98. With his death, the last human voice that could tell us what it sounded like to dive under a Japanese destroyer was silenced. That brings us to a reality that is both sad and motivating. We are the only ones left to carry this story. That is actually why we build this channel. We are trying to act as a digital archive for the courage that is slowly slipping out of living memory. If you feel a connection to these stories, or if you believe that men like those on the Harder deserve to be known by a generation that never met them, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. It is not just about supporting a video. It is about joining a community that values history. And if you have a family member who served in the silent service, please leave a comment below. We read them, and we honor them. The 79 men aboard the Harder. When she went down, came from 38 different states. They were farm boys from Iowa who had never seen the ocean, factory workers from Michigan, and college graduates from California. They volunteered for a service branch with the highest casualty rate of the entire war. 22% of submariners never came home. They knew the odds, and they climbed down the hatch anyway. Today, Commander Dealey has a marker at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 59, Grave 874. It is a quiet spot, far from the South China Sea. The headstone lists his name, his rank, and his Medal of Honor. But the most powerful epitaph isn't the medal. It is the simple phrase carved into the history books next to his name, Destroyer Killer. It is a title he earned not by hating the enemy, but by loving his crew enough to drive straight into the jaws of death to save them. The Harder may be gone, but thanks to that courage, and thanks to you for listening, she will never be forgotten.